All right, welcome back. We are now Genesis chapter 1, verse 24. We've gone through creation uh, for first day when God created light, all 5 days actually, creating of the earth, heavens and the earth, and the sea creatures, the ocean, the land, all those beautiful things. And now we're entering verse 24. And let's just jump on in. Verse 24, and it says, "And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so." And I'm like, this one is interesting to me because it says that God said, let the earth bring forth. Um, Other times we see God, it says, God said, let there be light, and then there was light. And then other times it's like God spoke the land into existence. And we see that here even, it's like, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind. And it's interesting, this living creature, because then it gives this another specific term, cattle, and then it says, and creeping thing. And then it says, and beasts of the earth after his kind. And I'm like, there's an apparent difference between cattle and beasts of the earth. And then it says, and it was so. But it's interesting to me that it's pointing out that there's a difference between cattle and beasts of the earth. And when I think about that, I'm like, what would be examples of like cattle versus beasts of the earth? And what I would think of is like cattle, cows, for obvious reasons. But then I'm thinking of animals that are herded or herd that roll in packs, as it were, maybe. Or maybe it's animals that are raised by humans, such as sheep, uh, goats, cows or cattle. Uh, you can even maybe say horses, things that have been, as we would say, heavily domesticated. Um, and then I compare that to the term beasts of the earth, and then I think of animals that have not maybe been domesticated, or not so easily domesticated. And when I think of those kind of animals like lions, tigers, wolves, maybe, to get in the dog family outside the cat family, but panthers, it's just interesting how even here we see God is pointing out there is a difference between the different types of animals, even as he's creating them. And then also all of these animals that are listed here, it says, and then a creeping thing. And it's like somewhere in between, there's like rabbits, I'm assuming. And then you have things that creep. It's like, now do cats creep? Are they considered creeping things? Or are we really talking about things like spiders and bugs and things like that? But I think all of those things are inclusive there, but I still find it interesting how there is this separation or identification that's pointed out between cattle and beasts of the earth. For example, another thing that may be a delineation between the two is one is a vegetarian and another is a meat eater, or carnivorous. The things I mentioned that were, I would think as beasts of the earth, that we would say is not so domesticated. Many of them are carnivorous. They eat other animals, other meat, and things like that, while the cattle, things like cows, um, uh, donkeys maybe, or even horses. What was the other one? Sheep. Those are generally vegetarian, type diets. That is, they don't eat meat, they don't eat animals, or other animals. Are usually eating vegetation. Like I know horses, they love apples, so I'm told. But they also love sugar too. That's a whole other. But it's just interesting seeing that God is pointing out these. He's acknowledging in His creation, in His as Moses wrote this, God giving him these words and these terms, Him pointing out that yes, He created these animals, and He acknowledges that there is a significant difference between them. So much so that He has a term that relates to this large group of types of animals that's different from other large groups of types of animals. Like we saw in one of the previous days, He created the fowl of the air, which is a different type of animal than the beasts of the field and cattle, as it were, and creeping things. So it's just interesting recognizing these things and thinking about that. And though there's not much time spent, like we will see, God will spend a significant number of verses, as it were, in the creation of man, but there's this significant still this verse allotment, if you will, time or space in the scripture, in this first chapter of a recounting of creation, that God points out these things. So let's move on. Verse 25, it says, "And God made the beasts of the earth after His kind." I didn't talk about this after His kind. It's really also interesting. It's like you see this, in verse 24, He talks about the beasts of the earth after His kind. And now verse 25 is reiterating it, as it were, or saying it again. But then it's a difference on how it's worded, because in verse 24 it says, "And God said, let the earth bring forth." But here it says, "And God made." So now it's, okay, in case you get it confused, let me make it plain for you. It's sort of like I'm taking it as the scriptures saying. It's like what God is telling us, the Holy Spirit who wrote this, or Jesus who wrote this, or God the Father who wrote this. All three of them are given a credit, or are accounted as being the ones who wrote the scripture or wrote the Bible. But it's this, and God made. So He's saying, I created this. He's taking acknowledgement and pointing out, making a purposeful declaration that He created them, that God was active and involved in this creation process. And to me, it's like the Lord, which we know He did anticipate this theory of evolution. And He's like, right here is, no, this wasn't evolved. This was, God made this. And I say evolution, not to say that evolution conceptually, I have to now define it, because in our society, this term evolution has so many definitions, so many associations with it. I have to clarify what I mean when I use the term, because I recognize that the term can be misconstrued or misunderstood because it's used so loosely and so freely, if you will, without explanation of what's really meant. So some will say there's an evolution of knowledge, and there's this knowledge that's obtained and shared and learned over time. And they call that a form of evolution. Others may say, well, it's evolution where animals or people learn things, and so they evolve. It's tied to this knowledge of things. Then you have those who want to say that there's an evolution in regards to a change of how one species or one creature, if we can use that word, as they would say, evolves into another type of creature. And that definition, the evolving of one creature into another type of creature that is drastically different, or minorly significantly different, I think here is pointing out that that's not so. And how do I come to that is because he says after his kind or after its kind, um, there's a kind of fish, and then there's another type of fish. Like you have a whiting type fish, you have red snapper, you have crawfish, you have catfish. All of them are types of fish, but so they would fall under sea creatures, but there's a difference between each one of them, and one does not become another. And so it's like when we think about that, understanding that concept that God is here saying that the beasts of the earth after his kind in verse 24. And then it says, bring forth the living creature after his kind earlier in verse 24. And here again, God's reiterating, as it were, in my mind, verse 25, and God made the beasts of the earth after his kind. So if it's after his kind, then there's this, they have their own kind, and they don't eventually become over thousands, millions, billions, pick your number, of years type deal. That's how I see it. It's just interesting how it's like, to me, God is already addressing those issues, and he's like, no, that's not how it went down. So moving on, though, it says in verse 25, it says, and God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind. It's interesting. He's like, he's now bringing it more detailed and being more specific in this. And he says, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. He's very descriptive now. He's before in verse 24, he just said, let the earth bring forth, and he says, and creeping thing. Now he's saying, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw it was good. Or you could say, and God saw that good. Because it is italicized, meaning it was not actually in the original Hebrew when it was written, but they're adding that to try to bring clarity to what's being said and spoken of. So, verse 26 starts a whole nother. So we're going to get there. But here it's like we've entered the 6th day of creation. As it was saying, the evening and the morning of the 5th was the 5th day, was in verse 23. And in verse 24, we start this 6th day. And on this 6th day, God has already created the earth, and now he's bringing forth the animals, the creeping things that are upon the earth. He's already created the sea life. He's already created the birds, the fowl, as it says in the scripture, King James Version. And now we see on this 6th day, he's now calling forth animal creatures, the animals of the earth, the animals that will dwell on the earth, as it were, that live on the earth. And we saw this description, this specifics of identification between creatures that are creeping things, creatures that are beasts, and creatures that are called cattle. And all of them after their kind. So now verse 26. Now this is going to get interesting. So then it says, and God said, let us make man in our image. You know, this is where we get this new term introduced, and that is us. And the us is referring to God. So it's, and God said, let us. This is where we start to see even more specifically, I should say, or explicitly, that God is one, and yet he's plural. as we talked about in first verse 1, remember correctly, I think I talked about it, but in God, well, actually in the beginning, verse 1, it says, in the beginning, God. That term God in the Hebrew is Elohim, which is actually a plural term. And if you know Hebrew, there is a delineation between a singular and then a dual, and then there's this plural. Now in the English language, we generally we have what we call singular and plural, and plural for the English could be two or more. And yet, even in our English language, we sometimes have terms that relate specifically to just two, as opposed to more than two, such as the term both. We would say, both of us went down the street, meaning there was two people there, as opposed to I went down the street, or she or he went down the street, or they went down the street. When we say they, it could mean two, but it could also mean three or more. But if we say both, then we're saying, oh, it was two of these people. In the Hebrew, they have that more specific type of separation. And in the Hebrew, the term Elohim is actually a plural. And you also, well, it's a plural. And so, won't get too deep into that. But anyway, so it says, and God said, let us. So we see it's not let I or let me, it's let us. And then it says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea. And what's interesting to me, I that just jumped at me just right now when I'm reading this, is it says, and let them. So we're just talking about this plural, right? I'm sorry. I'm just now recognizing this. This is beautiful. And it says, and God said, let us make man, right? Now, man, it didn't say men. And I know some translations will say human, but it's not a plural term here. It's a singular term. It's let us make man in our image. Actually, let me make sure that's true, because let me take it back to the original Hebrew. I didn't take that one to the original Hebrew. This is actually something new I didn't thought about or check that too. So let's go to that. It says, and let us make man, which is the term Adam, man or mankind is how it's translated. Man, human being, man, mankind, much more frequently intended sense in the Old Testament. Adam, first man. It's also a city that was in the Jordan Valley. That's what this concordance is telling me. But we see that it tells us parts of speech is a noun, masculine, association to it, as it were, in regards to gender, and yet even in our English language, we will use a masculine term that can also include the feminine. For example, we may talk to a group of people and we'll say, hey, you guys, even though we're saying guys, which usually is associated with a masculine gender, it may be feminine genders that are in that group. And it's not a disrespect to them, but we're trying to limit how many terms we're using. So we'll say, hey, you guys, let's go down the street to somewhere, or let's do this or do that. And so there's that association that can be included with both male and female. But let's move forward. I'm trying to get too deep. It says, let us make man in our image. And then the thing that got me right now was after our likeness, and let them. So it's already this acknowledgement that there's more than one, which we're going to see in more detail as he goes more in detail in the creation of humans. So he says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the, this is interesting, he's already giving them dominion before he actually created them. Because he's saying, let us make. So he's like, this is a plan. There's an agreement that we're coming to, that we're going to do this. It's something we're about to do. Let us make man and let them have dominion over. Check what is happening with guys saying the humans are to have dominion. We know it's humans because he said them. So he wasn't talking about man, masculine, singular. He was talking about humans, male and female, them, because he said them. And we'll get even more clarification as we continue, because he gets more detailed in clarifying these things. But he says, let them have dominion over, one, the fish of the sea. Remember, we talked about that. He had created the fish of the sea on a different day. And then he says, and over the fowl of the air, which he created on a different day. And over the cattle, which he created on this same day. And then he says, and over all the earth, and it's interesting here. Then it says, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. In this verse, verse 26, his declaration of what humans are to have dominion over specifically is over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. What I find interesting to me is what's not said. We talked about that a little bit in one of the other days. But note, in this verse 26, it doesn't say over the beast of the field. And why is that interesting? Because I'm like, just two verses ahead. One verse ahead, one verse before, and two verses before, he explicitly separates or delineates or identifies the beasts of the field and the cattle, which is saying there's a difference there. So here, he doesn't tell explicitly, listing out, that is, the beasts of the field, which I find interesting because I'm like, what is it about these beasts of the field that God didn't say explicitly when he's like, let us make man, let us make humans, and let them have dominion? He doesn't tell us that. He doesn't say, let them have dominion over the beasts of the field. Now, what's interesting is, though it's not explicitly said, technically it's covered because it does say in verse 26 still, in the latter part, after he says, and over the cattle, he says, and over all the earth. Well, one can interpret that to mean not including the beasts of the field, or one can say it does include the beasts of the field because they're on the earth. But you could also make an argument that when he says over all the earth, maybe he's talking about the earth. Remember when we talked about when he created the earth and he spoke the land to come forth. He created it and he says, land come forth from the waters, which was, we went into that. We won't go into that again, but we need to go deep in there. But yeah, anyway, so, but here he says over all the earth. And when we talked about the earth, when he brought forth that land and he called it earth, we noticed that it was land, which to me was, like we talked about a little bit, was different from the water. So one can make the argument that, oh, he's saying humans, mankind, if you will have dominion, let them have dominion over all the earth. That is, rule and have dominion over the earth, land itself, which of course would include, in my mind, all that is produced by the land, such as plant life. Now, one can argue that all of the animal kind came from the earth because we saw in verse 25, it said, let the earth bring forth. And he mentions all these animals. Well, he says creatures, living creatures first, after his kind. And I didn't go into that. I'm like, living creatures. What's so different about this living creature compared to cattle and compared to creeping thing and beasts of the field, or beasts of the earth, actually, as it says in verse 24. Now, I'm like, the fact that there's a description that's pointing out a difference to me, a difference about it, means to me that there's something different about it. Now, what that difference is, may be up for debate, as it were, or discussion. But let's move on. And so he says, in creeping thing, in verse 26, on the end part, let them have dominion over. And he says, over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. Again, he's pointing out specific things. I'm like, he could have included the beasts of the field, but he didn't include the beasts of the field in this verse. It makes me wonder why. And then, this is my just musings. So, I told you this is me musing. My musings is going back to what I talked about in verse 24. The differences between cattle and beasts of the field. We don't, as humans, just have lions roaming around in our farmland, as it were. If you have a farm, or right now it's a big thing, homesteading, as they call it, where you're raising animals for feed or for their milk, such as cows and goats, or you're raising sheep for their wool and also for their meat, also and such. Or some, well, at any rate. But yes, so you have these type of animals, but you don't hear about, on the homestead or on my farm, I had some lions there too, or I had some panthers just hanging out, and they're part of the family, I take care of them. That's not how that works, they're known as wild animals, and it's not to say that you can't domesticate, as it were, a lion, because we see the lions in the circuses and in other types of avenues that are interacting with humans. But it's not something that you put on your farm. Matter of fact, you don't want the lion in your farm. You don't want the fox in your farm. You don't want the sometimes people don't want the deer in their farm. I mean, in their on their farm, because they don't want the deer to eat all the vegetation, or in your garden. If you want to call it that. I know gardens is another term that's got a broadness. I mean, you can have the square foot garden as, or the backyard garden, or the garden that's on your front porch or on your windowsill. And then you can have a garden that's acres long, or acres across acres of land. Though typically they would say, well, no, you're actually farming at that point. And there's not a specific, I mean, people have tried to put specifics, but there's not a hard nose, I would say, delineation of separation between when it's a garden until it becomes a farm. We won't get into that. But anyway, it's just interesting to me how there's this separation of beasts of the field and cattle. And that's how I make that separation. But again, here talking about verse 26, he doesn't say let them, mankind and humans, have dominion over the beasts of the field explicitly. He doesn't specifically say that, and I find that interesting. But let's move forward. We're going to get to the end of this chapter. We're going to get there. May have to make this 2 videos. I'm not sure how long I've gone. But verse 27, moving forward. So God created man in his own image, and in the image of God created he him. I got to stop right there, because we're seeing this again, paying attention to the details that are said and the details that are not so much said. So now God is now saying, so he created man in his own. In the King James Version, it's italicized, which means this is something that was added to help bring clarification in the reading of it, so it makes sense in the English language. But he says, in his own image, or we could say in his image. In the image of God created he him. There's a difference between created in his own image or in his image, as opposed to in the image of God created he him. I'm not going to get too deep into that one, but there's a difference on how you word those things and what they really mean. Then it says, in case you're getting things confused, because he said he, him, he made it masculine. Then he says male and female. Wait a minute here. So he's now pointing out there is a difference here. Male and female created he them. This is all the same verse. So verse 27, let's read it again. So God created man. So we now know this is humans, like we talked about when we talked about verse 26. In his own image, in the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. There's a lot there. Oh, there's so much there, but I'm just going to move forward. I'm going to move forward. It's a lot there. Verse 28, and God blessed them. Notice how it didn't say God blessed him. That's interesting. God blessed them. And God said unto them, so that's not confused. He's talking to man, humans, male and female. God said to, where'd I go? Verse 20, lost my spot. Verse 28. And God said unto them, so now that the fact that he can say unto them means that they are now there, they have been formed, created. He said unto them, be fruitful. Now he's giving a command. Now in verse 26, remember, it's like this is previous tense. He's before he actually done this. He's like, let us make this. Let us do this. Let's come into agreement. He's talking. We'll find out more clarity. But like I told you in the verse 1, if I remember correctly, we verse 1 and 2 we saw the Trinity represented there. But here we see another representation. Is this hint, as it were, this pointing to God being one, and yet God being more than one, but he's one. And we can't really comprehend that, but we'll move forward. But he says, and God blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Now I got to stop there because he used an interesting word, replenish. Replenish. Replenish means that that there needed to be something that was already plenished, and now it needs to be replenished. In other words, there was something there. We talked about in verse 2 before. There was something that was there before, and now it needs to be, as it were, replaced with. So this is not the first. This is another, because we had to replenish something. We had to replace it. We had to, what's the word? Replenish actually is better than replace, because replace has a different connotation to it. But replenish, it was something was there. When I go to the proverbial cookie jar and I eat the cookies that were in the cookie jar, I need to replenish the cookie jar with more cookies, right? So there's again this pointing to that something happened, and now he's creating man, and he's telling man, replenish the earth. And we don't really know exactly what is all entailed in that term replenish, but we can recognize that something happened before, because God is now telling us to replenish the earth. But let's move forward. Like I said, that there's so much there, and yeah, moving forward. Verse 28, and he continues. It says, and subdue it. So he says, God blessed them. God said unto them, be fruitful. This is part of the blessing, and multiply. So there's a difference between being fruitful and multiplying, because there's a separation in that. We won't get deep into that, because this will be here all night. Well, for multiple videos talking about this. So, and like I said, Genesis 1, yeah, this is good. Moving forward, replenish the earth, and be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it. Now he already said, let them have dominion. Now he's saying to the male and the female, subdue the earth, replenish the earth, multiply upon the earth. Be fruitful upon the earth. And continuing, and have dominion, now this is deep, over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Now remember, I just talked about, when we talked about verse 26, he said, let them have dominion. But now he's telling us again, after he's created now. And so now man is here, he's saying to man, to humans, to male and female, because he just said that, to male and female. He's saying, I'm blessed, I blessed them, and then he's telling them to have dominion over the fish of the sea. Now remember, I talked about, I was like, in verse 26, I was like, this is mind-boggling. I had to point out that it wasn't including these things. He didn't include the fish of the sea in verse 26. He didn't include, but he did include the fowl of the air. I'm sorry, stand corrected. Verse 26, he included the fish of the sea. He included the fowl of the air. And he explicitly said in verse 26, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. But here in verse 28, he says, have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. So now he's gotten broader in his terms in coverage of all that he's talking about, and didn't get as specific. In verse 26, he was specific. He said, over the cattle and over all the earth. So it was a specific, it's not that he wasn't specific. He got specific in one part, and then got general and broad termed in another, in that he said in verse 26, over the cattle specifically, and then over all the earth. Here in verse 28 now, he just says, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. He's like, I'm not going to talk about the creeping thing explicitly. I'm not going to talk about the beasts of the field specifically. I'm not going to talk about the cattle specifically. I'm going to say over everything that moves upon the earth, have dominion. I perceive my time is up on this one. Yeah. We're going to have to get to verse 29 on the next video, because this video is going to get long. Probably is long already. Wow. There's a lot there. There's a lot there. Thank you for joining me. This was good. Looking forward. So hopefully next time we'll complete this chapter. We'll get the next three verses, verse 29 through 31. That was good. Thank you for joining me.